the sea whispers. It has always been my companion, from the bustling quays of my youth in Ugarit to this quiet shore where my days now draw to a close. The water before me is the same great green that carried the ships of pharaohs, the timber of Byblos, the copper of Elishia, and the ambitions of kings. It speaks in a language older than any cuneiform, a slow, rhythmic hush and draw, a sighing that tells of fullness and of emptiness. Tonight the tide is low, exposing the dark, wet bones of the world, and the scent of salt and ancient secrets is strong on the air. It reminds me of the great tide of our age, the one that receded so slowly, so quietly that many did not even notice it was gone until they found themselves stranded. My name is Amun Sharu, though few remember it now. Once, I was a son of Ugarit, a city that drank from the cup of the world. My father was a merchant of some standing, but my mind was ever drawn to the precise and beautiful dance of words on clay. I learned the scripts of our neighbors as other boys learned the rigging of a ship. I could speak the flowing tongue of the Egyptians, the guttural commands of the Hittites, and the lilting, boastful speech of the Achaean lords. This gift for language became my life's vessel, and it carried me into the courts of the great kings, those men who believed their world was as eternal as the sun's daily journey. I was a diplomat, a messenger, a weaver of treaties and a polisher of fragile truths. I saw the world at its zenith, when the bronze gleamed brightest, and I was there to watch the light begin to fade. It did not happen with a crash, with the sound of 1,000 trumpets of war. It began as a change in the music of the world, a single note played slightly out of tune, a harmony that was almost, but not quite, right. It began in the ledgers and the letters, the quiet, clay-bound heart of our civilization. My first journey of true consequence was to the land of the Hittites, to the formidable city of Hattusa, nestled high in the Anatolian plateau. To a boy from the warm coast, the journey itself was a lesson in the world's vastness. We left the familiar embrace of the sea, the scent of cedar and myrrh, and traveled inland, following the caravans. The air grew thinner, cooler. The soft limestone of our coast gave way to harsh gray rock that seemed to have been torn from the earth by angry gods. The world became a place of stone and sky. And then Hattusa. It was not beautiful in the way Thebes was beautiful, with its gilded pillars and avenues of sphinxes. Hattusa was strong. It was a city built to endure. Its double walls, crafted from immense cyclopean stones, rose from the rocky landscape as if they were a part of it, a natural feature of the earth. I remember passing through the Lion Gate for the first time. The great stone beasts, their mouths open in a silent, eternal roar, were not merely decorations. They were declarations of power, guardians against any force, mortal or divine, that might dare to challenge the great king, my son, the ruler of Hatti. Inside, the city was a labyrinth of stone-paved streets, climbing and descending the rugged hills upon which it was built. The buildings were sturdy, functional, their lower courses of stone and their upper stories of mud brick and timber. The air was filled with the clang of smiths, hammers, for Hatti was a land of warriors, and their power was forged in bronze. But its true heart, I soon learned, was not the forge or the barracks, but the archive. I was taken to the court of the great King Tudela. He was a stern man, his face lined with the cares of an empire that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the borders of Mesopotamia. He sat not on a golden throne like Pharaoh, but on a solid carved wooden chair, a first among equals, the chief steward of his people and their 1,000 gods. The audience chamber was vast, its wooden ceiling supported by thick pillars, the air cool and smelling of pine smoke from the braziers. We presented our gifts from Ugarit, fine purple-dyed wool, jars of scented olive oil, and an exquisite inlaid gaming box. The king accepted them with a curt nod, his eyes assessing, always assessing. My duties kept me in Hattusa for many months, and I was granted access to the scribal houses on the great Acropolis, Buyukale. Here, in rooms stacked high with wooden shelves, lay the memory of the kingdom, tens of thousands of clay tablets. There were the grand treaties, bound in bronze or silver, like the one with the great Ramesses of Egypt, a promise of eternal peace sworn between the two most powerful lands on earth. There were law codes, meticulous and fair, detailing everything from the price of a donkey to the punishment for sorcery. There were annals of kings, boasting of their conquests. But most of all, there were letters. Day after day, I would sit in the cool, dusty light, the only sound, the soft scratch of a stylus on wet clay, and read the correspondence of the world. Letters from vassal kings in Syria, pledging loyalty and begging for troops. Missives from trade partners in Assyria, arguing over the price of tin. Reports from governors in the western lands, complaining of troublesome tribes. It was a vast, intricate web, and Hattusa was the patient spider at its center, feeling every tremor. In those early days, the web felt strong, unbreakable. The letters spoke of confidence, of order. A shipment of grain would be dispatched, a rebellious prince would be punished, a marriage would be arranged to seal an alliance. The world was a complex but understandable machine, and the great kings were its master mechanics. I would spend my evenings looking out over the city from the Acropolis as the sun set behind the jagged peaks. The smoke from 1,000 hearths would rise into the crisp air, and the city would seem like a great, sleeping beast, secure in its rocky lair. I felt a sense of profound permanence, as solid as the stone lions at the gate. The world, I thought, would always be this way. The tide was high, and the shores of civilization felt safe and dry. My next great journey took me in the opposite direction, south, to the land of Egypt, the kingdom of the two horizons. If Hatti was a fortress of stone, Egypt was a temple of light. The voyage itself was a slow descent into a different world. We sailed past the coast of the Levant, the familiar ports of Tyre and Byblos, and then into the great expanse of the sea. For days we saw nothing but blue water and bluer sky. Then, a change. The water became tinged with brown, filled with the rich lifeblood of the Nile flowing out to meet the great green. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth, lotus flowers, and 1,000 years of history. We arrived at the great port city of Pi-Ramesses, the new capital built by the mighty Ramesses the Great. It was a city not of stone, but of spectacle. Everything was designed to awe. Wide canals lined with trees crisscrossed the city, filled with barges carrying goods from the furthest reaches of the empire, gold and ivory from Nubia, incense from Punt, leopard skins from the deep south. The palaces and temples were vast complexes of brightly painted mud brick and sandstone, their walls covered in vibrant frescoes and hieroglyphs that told the stories of gods and kings. Pylons towered over everything, their surfaces carved with scenes of Pharaoh smiting his enemies, his arm raised in eternal victory. The court of Pharaoh Merneptah, the son of the great Ramesses, was a world away from the stern, martial court of Hattusa. Here everything was ritual, performance, and divine theater. Pharaoh was not a man, he was a god on earth, the living Horus. To approach him was to approach the sun itself. I was led through a series of courtyards, each more magnificent than the last. Fountains splashed in gardens filled with exotic plants. Officials in bleached white linen robes glided silently past, their faces serene and inscrutable. The air was thick with the scent of lotus and expensive perfumes. The audience hall was a forest of colossal pillars painted to look like bundles of papyrus reeds, reaching up to a ceiling painted with golden stars on a lapis lazuli sky. At the far end, bathed in a beam of light from a high window, sat Pharaoh. He seemed to float, a small, still figure amidst overwhelming grandeur. He wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, and his face was a mask of divine indifference. Our greetings were not spoken directly to him, but through a series of viziers and chamberlains, each word weighed and measured. It was a place where tradition was the air one breathed. Nothing had changed, it seemed, for 1,000 years. Nothing ever would. I spent my time in Egypt not in a dusty archive, but in the great temples of Karnak and Luxor, near the old capital of Thebes. I walked through halls of pillars so vast they dwarfed a man into insignificance. I watched the priests perform the daily rituals to honor Amun-Ra, rituals that ensured the sun would rise, the Nile would flood, and the cosmic order, the sacred principle of ****, would be maintained. Asterisk ma'at, asterisk was everything. Truth, justice, balance, order. It was the opposite of chaos. And the entire purpose of the Egyptian state, from pharaoh down to the humblest farmer, was to uphold it. The scribes I met here were not concerned with the petty squabbles of vassal kings. They were busy calculating the height of the inundation, composing hymns to the gods, and writing texts for the dead, guidebooks to the underworld to ensure a safe passage to the afterlife. Their world was eternal. Their king was eternal. Their civilization was a placid, sacred river, flowing endlessly through time. I would sit by the Nile in the evenings, watching the feluccas drift by with their tall white sails. The sun would set in a blaze of orange and purple, sinking into the western desert, the land of the dead, only to be reborn, without fail, in the east the next morning. The world felt not just permanent, but divinely ordained. This was the high summer of our age, and it seemed impossible that winter could ever come. And then there was the third corner of our great world, the lands of the Achaeans across the Great Green. They were not a single, unified empire like Egypt or Hatti. They were a collection of proud, quarrelsome kingdoms, each ruled by a wanax, a warrior king from his high, fortified citadel. My journey to them was the most perilous, a true sea voyage into waters that were not always friendly. The ship was different, sleeker, with a high, curved prow built for speed. The sailors were loud, bearded men who sang songs of heroes and monsters. We landed on a rocky coast, a land of silver-green olive groves, sun-drenched hills, and the constant, sighing presence of the sea. I was taken to Mycenae, the citadel of the dynasty of Atreus, rich in gold. Like Hattusa, it was a fortress, but its spirit was entirely different. Hattusa was grim and grounded. Mycenae was proud and fierce. I passed through its lion gate, so different from the one in Hatti. These lions were leaner, more dynamic, their heads, once cast in bronze, now lost to time. They were guardians, yes, but also a boast, a symbol of the predatory power of their masters. The walls were built of stones so massive that later, simpler generations would say they were built by the Cyclopes. Inside, the palace was not a sprawling complex of administrative buildings, but centered around one great hall, the Megaron. I remember it vividly. You passed through a porch with 2 columns into a vestibule, and then into the main chamber. In the center was a great circular hearth, its plaster painted with flames and spirals. 4 pillars supported the roof, which had an opening to let out the smoke. The walls were covered in brilliant frescoes, alive with color and movement. There were scenes of hunting, of warriors, in their terrifying boar-tusk helmets and tower shields. There were processions of graceful ladies with elaborate hairstyles. And there were the bulls, leaping, charging, magnificent bulls, with daring young men and women vaulting over their horns in a dance of life and death. The wanax I met was not a god like Pharaoh or a remote administrator like the Hittite king. He was a warlord. His throne was in the Megaron, by the hearth. He drank wine from a golden cup, and his bearded face was scarred from battle. His wealth was not in vast fields of grain, but in movable things, bronze tripods, inlaid daggers, chests of fragrant oil, and chariots. His power was personal, charismatic. He ruled through a network of retainers and warriors, the asterisk, Lawagatai asterisk, who feasted with him in his hall and followed him to war. The world of the Achaeans ran on a different kind of clay tablet. Their script, which we now call Linear B, was a mystery to me then, a beautiful but impenetrable series of signs and pictures. But I saw the scribes at their work in the palace of Pylos, another great citadel. Their records were not of grand treaties or hymns to gods. They were inventories. So many jars of olive oil, so many wheels for chariots, so many kilograms of bronze allocated to a smith, so many rowers assigned to a ship. It was the meticulous accounting of a well-run estate, a system designed to control every resource, to equip armies for raids and trade. Their world was one of constant motion, of ships setting out to Troy, to Crete, to Egypt, to my own home in Ugarit, always seeking, acquiring, and boasting. I spent my evenings in the Megaron, the great hearth fire casting dancing shadows on the painted walls. The bards would sing, accompanying themselves on a lyre, telling long tales of the glorious deeds of heroes, of their squabbles with the gods, of their long and dangerous sea voyages. It was a loud, vibrant, and confident world, a world of bronze-clad heroes who seemed to believe they could challenge the gods themselves. Ugarit, Egypt, Hatti, Mycenae. These were the four pillars that held up the sky of our world. Their kings called each other brother. They exchanged lavish gifts: gold from Egypt, silver from Hatti, fine textiles from Syria, and exquisite metalwork from the Aegean. They exchanged princesses in marriage. Their scribes wrote to each other in the common tongue of Akkadian cuneiform. Their ships crisscrossed the Great Green, weaving a tapestry of commerce and culture. The world was stable. It was prosperous. It was eternal. The tide was at its highest point, serene and majestic, reflecting the golden sun of a long and peaceful afternoon. The first hint of the turning tide was not a storm, but a subtle change in the currents. It was something I first noticed, not in a king's court, but on the docks of my own city, Ugarit. Our city lived on trade. It was the throat through which the world drank. Tin from the distant west, beyond the pillars of Heracles, would arrive and be sent overland to Mesopotamia. Copper from Alasha, the island of Cyprus, filled our warehouses before being forged into tools and weapons. Timber from our own mountains was loaded onto Egyptian ships to build their temples. We were the nexus, the meeting point. For generations, the rhythms of trade had been as predictable as the seasons. But then, small things began to change. A merchant expecting a shipment of tin would find the ship was 3 months late. When it finally arrived, the captain would speak of new dangers in the western seas, of coastal towns that were strangely deserted, of pirates who were bolder and better organized than before. The price of tin began to rise, slowly at first, then with more urgency. Then it was the copper from Alasha. A letter would arrive from the king there, an old friend of our court. He would write to my king, his brother, and instead of the usual flowery greetings and discussion of exchange rates for goods, there would be a new note of anxiety. He would mention ships of the enemy being sighted off his coast. At first it was dismissed as the usual piracy. But the reports became more frequent. One year, the main copper shipment was half its usual size. The official reason given was a miners' strike. But the merchants whispered that the coastal mining towns were being abandoned, their people fleeing inland from unknown assailants who came from the sea. I saw it in the letters that passed through my hands. I was in Hattusa again, in the cool, familiar archives. The letters from the vassal states in Syria and the Levant began to change their tone. For years, they had been a litany of petty squabbles, border disputes, arguments over water rights, accusations of theft. Now, a new word appeared again and again: Habiru. A vague term. It could mean outlaws, refugees, landless wanderers. But now they were gathering in larger numbers, raiding caravan routes, threatening the smaller towns. The Hittite governors requested more troops to maintain order, but the great king was distracted. There was a new problem, a deeper one. The rains had failed in the heartland of Anatolia for several years in a row. The letters were no longer about bronze and treaties, but about grain. Urgent, desperate letters. I recall one, sent from the great king Tudela to the pharaoh of Egypt. It was couched in the formal language of diplomacy, the language of brothers. "The land of Hatti is in distress," it read. "May my brother send grain in his ships to keep the land of Hatti alive." Egypt, ever the bountiful mother, sent the grain. The crisis was averted, for a time. But the request itself was a tremor, a sign of a deep weakness in the stony foundations of the Hittite Empire. A kingdom of warriors could not fight a drought. I traveled back to Egypt during this time. The surface of life along the Nile was as serene as ever. The priests made their offerings, the farmers planted their crops, and the scribes recorded the eternal glories of Pharaoh. But even here, in the land of divine order, the whispers of chaos from the outside world were beginning to be heard. The great forts along the western border, in the Libyan desert, were sending reports of entire tribes on the move, displaced people pushed eastward by what? No one was sure. They were seeking new lands, and they were armed. Pharaoh Merneptah fought a great battle against these Libyan tribes and their allies. The reliefs carved on the temple walls at Karnak showed his glorious victory. Pharaoh had upheld Guada. He had driven back the forces of chaos. But I spoke with a commander who had been in the battle. He told me something unsettling. Among the Libyan warriors were strange, tall men with fair skin and feathered helmets. They carried round shields and long, bronze swords of a type he had never seen before. They fought with a desperate ferocity. They were not Libyans. They were from somewhere else, from across the sea. They were the first drops of a storm that was gathering far out on the horizon. On my final visit to the Achaean lands, the change was more palpable. The laughter in the Megaron seemed a little louder, a little more forced. The songs of the bards were still of heroic deeds, but they also sang of cities lost and heroes who did not return. The Wanax of Pylos, when I saw him, was not planning a new trading voyage. He was overseeing the strengthening of his citadel's walls. And in the scribal chambers, the nature of the clay tablets had changed. I saw one, a simple inventory, but it was chilling. It was a list of watchers on the coast. It detailed how many men were stationed at various points along the shore, a human chain to give warning of strange ships. Another tablet was a record of bronze being collected from the temples, requisitioned to be melted down for weapons. The title of the tablet was, "For the Gods, for Spears and Swords." When a kingdom begins to take bronze from its gods to arm its soldiers, you know that fear has taken root. The intricate web of trade and diplomacy that had bound our world together was beginning to fray, strand by strand. A delayed shipment of tin, a poor harvest in Anatolia, a band of refugees on the Egyptian border, a coastal watch in Pylos. Each was a small thing, a local problem to be managed. No one, not even I, who traveled between the courts and saw the different pieces, could yet see the pattern. We could not imagine that the entire tapestry was unraveling. The tide was turning. The water, which had been so high and calm, was beginning to draw back from the shore so slowly, so silently, that we mistook the sound for the familiar sighing of the waves. The slow receding of the world continued. It was like a long, wasting sickness in a once strong man. The symptoms were varied and appeared in different places at different times, yet they all pointed to the same quiet decay of the vital organs of our civilization. The letters that crossed my desk in Ugarit were no longer filled with the confident pronouncements of kings, but with a rising chorus of anxiety. I remember a series of tablets from the king of Alashia. For years his letters had been about the price of copper and the occasional complaint about Ugaritian merchants. Now they were frantic. "My father," he wrote to my king, "behold, the enemy's ships came. They have set fire to my cities and have done evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Luca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. May my father consider this." That letter sent a chill through the court. The king of Alashia's forces were abroad, serving his treaty obligations to the Hittites, and his own island was now defenseless. The web of alliances, once a source of strength, had become a trap. Who were these enemies in their ships? The letter did not say. They were simply the enemy, a faceless, nameless force that came from the sea, burned and vanished. From Hatti, the news was even more grim. The drought had not been a passing affliction. It was a deep-seated change in the climate, a great dryness that settled over the Anatolian plateau. The annals of the later Hittite kings were no longer grand lists of conquests. They were records of desperate campaigns to secure grain supplies from their Syrian vassals. The great king, once the brother of Pharaoh, was now reduced to pleading with cities like my own for food. I was in the city of Emar on the Euphrates when a Hittite commander arrived with a contingent of troops. He was not there to project power, but to requisition grain. I spoke with him in the evening. He was a weary man, his face etched with worry. "The 1,000 gods of Hatti are thirsty," he told me, staring into his cup of beer. "The springs run low and the fields are dust. We have forgotten the words to the hymns that bring rain." He spoke of entire villages in the heartland being abandoned, their people simply walking away, heading south towards the greener lands of Syria, becoming part of those wandering bands of Astric Habiru. The stone heart of the empire was turning to dust from the inside out. The Achaean world was also growing darker. The trade in their fine, painted pottery, which had once reached every corner of the Great Green, dwindled and then ceased. We heard stories, carried by desperate sailors on leaky ships, of citadels falling, not to foreign invaders, but to each other. In a world of scarcity, the warrior kings had turned on one another, raiding their neighbors for food and bronze. The great palace at Pylos, with its beautiful frescoes and its meticulous archives, was burned to the ground. The linear bead tablets were baked hard in the fire that destroyed it, preserving for us the last, frantic records of a kingdom preparing for a final, doomed defense. The art of writing would be lost in those lands for centuries to come, the intricate knowledge of the scribes vanishing like smoke from a funeral pyre. Even mighty Egypt, the eternal kingdom, was feeling the pressure. The new pharaoh, Ramesses III, spent his entire reign as a warrior, not a builder. The inscriptions he carved at his great temple at Medinet Habu were not of peaceful trade and divine offerings, but of war. A new, greater wave of enemies was breaking upon the shores of the delta. He called them the peoples of the sea. His inscriptions tell the story with chilling clarity. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms, from Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia on, being cut off at one time. A camp was set up in one place in Amaru. They desolated its people, and its land was like that which has never come into being. They were coming forward toward Egypt, while the flame was prepared before them. Think of those words. Scattered in the fray, like that which has never come into being. This was not a normal war of kings fighting over territory. This was a storm of displaced humanity. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show them. The Peliset and their feathered helmets, the Sheridan with their horned helmets and round shields, the Shekelesh, the Weshesh. They came not just as warriors, but with their families and ox carts, their women and children, carrying all their worldly goods. They were not raiding for plunder, they were searching for a new home. Their own lands, wherever they were, had been lost to famine, war, or some other catastrophe we will never know. Ramesses III fought them on land and sea. He won a great, bloody victory. The carvings show Egyptian soldiers overwhelming the enemy ships, a chaotic scene of drowning men and splintered wood. Egypt was saved. Ma'at was preserved. But it was a victory that drained the kingdom. The treasury was emptied to pay the mercenaries who fought in Pharaoh's army. The northern territories in the Levant, which had supplied so much tribute, were lost forever. Egypt survived, but it was diminished. It pulled back into itself, closing the doors of its golden house, its gaze turning inward, away from the collapsing world outside. The river still flowed, but the kingdom on its banks was tired. And what of my own city, Ugarit? We were the last to feel the full force of the storm. We were rich, we were clever, and we were useful to everyone. We thought our wealth and our diplomacy could protect us. We continued to send out our ships, to write our letters, to live in our beautiful villas with their courtyards and pools. I was an old man by then, my hair the color of seafoam. I served the king as an advisor, my knowledge of the great courts now more a matter of history than current affairs. The world I had known as a young man was gone. Hatti was a ghost, its great capital of Hattusa abandoned to the wind and the wolves. The Achaean palaces were smoking ruins, their people scattered, their kings forgotten. Only Egypt remained, wounded and withdrawn. We were an island of prosperity in a sea of chaos. The final days came quickly, with the inevitability of the setting sun. A tablet was found in the ruins of a kiln, unbaked, a letter that was never sent. It was from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alashia, a desperate reply to an earlier plea. My father, it said, the ships of the enemy are upon us. We do not know what to do. I remember the last week. The fear was a palpable thing in the air, thicker than the scent of the sea. Refugees from the north had been trickling in for months, telling stories of cities burned along the coast. Now the trickle had become a flood. They camped outside the city walls, their faces hollow with hunger and terror. The king ordered every available man to the walls. The merchants frantically buried hoards of gold and precious objects beneath the floors of their houses, hoping to return for them one day. In the scribal schools, the students were no longer practicing hymns. They were learning a new, simpler kind of script, an alphabet, a desperate innovation in a time when there was no leisure for the old, complex ways. One morning, a watcher from the highest tower of the Temple of Baal sent up the cry, "Sails." On the horizon. not the familiar square sails of Egyptian grain ships or the sleek lines of our own vessels. These were different. Many of them. They moved with a grim purpose. There was no great battle. Our army was far away, fighting for the Hittites in a war that was already lost. Our fleet was patrolling the coast of Lucca, protecting trade routes that no longer led anywhere. The city was a hollow shell. There was no sound of trumpets, no formal declaration of war. There was only the scrape of keels on the beach, the shouting of strange tongues, and then the smoke. It began in the port district, a thick, black column rising into the placid blue sky. Then another, from the merchants' quarter. I did not see the end. Some of us, the king's family and a few advisors, were hurried out of a small western gate, making for the hills. I looked back only once. My beautiful city, the city of scholars and sailors, the crossroads of the world, was being consumed by fire. The great library, with its thousands of tablets of poetry, of myth, of law, of letters, the memory of our world, was being baked into permanence by the flames that destroyed it. We fled into the hills, a small, sad procession of ghosts. We had nowhere to go. The world we had known, the world of palaces and scribes, of great kings and grand ambitions, was gone. It had not been conquered by a new empire. It had simply collapsed. It had crumbled under the weight of its own complexity, pushed by drought, by migration, by the severing of the delicate threads of trade that had held it all together. The tide had gone out, and we were left on a vast, empty shore, littered with the wreckage of a world that had been. The night that followed that day was a long one. A dark age fell upon the lands of the great green. Writing was forgotten. The great cities became quarries for the hovels of squatters. The art of painting frescoes, of building citadels, of casting bronze in intricate forms, all was lost. Life became smaller, poorer, more local. People forgot that there had ever been a time when kings called each other brother across the sea. The stories of the great heroes of Mycenae became myths, told around campfires by people who could not believe such a world had ever been real. I lived out my remaining years in a small village not far from the ruins of my home. I taught the children the old stories, though I doubt they understood. I watched the seasons turn. I saw new people arrive, simpler people, with iron tools instead of bronze. They built their small villages on the ashes of the old world. And now, I sit by the sea. It is the same sea. It whispers its same eternal story. It knows nothing of kings or empires. It only knows the slow, patient rhythm of the tide. The water is so far out now, the sand stretching on and on under the pale light of the moon. It feels as though it will never come back. But the sea always returns. It is its nature. The tide does not go out forever. After the lowest ebb comes the slow, quiet turn. And then, inch by inch, the water begins to creep back up the sand. It will take a long time, generations, centuries. But it will return. New ships will be built. New cities will rise. Perhaps not as grand, but they will rise. New words will be written. The world will be reborn. But it will be a different world. The memory of ours will be a whisper, a myth, a layer of ash buried deep beneath the ground. A bedtime story for a new age. The night air is cool. The stars are bright, the same stars that guided the Achaean sailors and the Hittite kings. They are silent witnesses. They saw the tide at its height, and they see it now at its lowest ebb. They know the secret rhythm of it all. The sound of the waves is a soft, shushing sound. A lullaby for a sleeping world. The tide has turned. It is beginning so slowly you can barely see it, to come back in. Time to rest. Time to sleep. The world is quiet now. The great kings are silent. The palaces are dust. The letters are baked clay. All is still. The sea whispers. And it is time now to sleep.